A baby girl, just 5 days old, was found lying beside her mother's lifeless body. Her tiny cries were the only sound left in a home that had gone quiet forever. In 3 other homes, just down the road, 7 more members of the same family were also found shot in their beds. No one heard the gunshots. No one saw the killers come or go. And when the sun rose that morning in Pike County, Ohio, it revealed one of the most disturbing mass murders in the state's history. The victims were fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. Some were shot in their sleep. One was killed while breastfeeding, another while resting on a couch. All of them executed in the dark hours before dawn, each shot with chilling precision. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear motive, and no suspects. This wasn't random. It was a message, a calculated act of violence meant to destroy a family to its core. For 2 years, authorities chased whispers and shadows. Meanwhile, a small community lived in fear, unsure if the killers were still among them. What investigators eventually uncovered was even more disturbing than anyone imagined. And at the center of it all was a custody battle. A father, a mother, and a secret plan so deeply rooted in control, it would claim 8 lives before it ended. Pike County, Ohio, a place where folks know each other by name. It's quiet country. Rolling hills, long gravel roads, and homes that sit far apart. People there work hard, on farms, in construction, small family businesses. It's the kind of place where you wave at strangers and leave your doors unlocked. The Rhoden family was well known in Piketon. Not famous, just familiar. They were a large extended group, brothers, sisters, cousins, kids, spread out across several trailer homes along Union Hill Road and Left Fork Road. They stuck together, they worked together, and they helped each other. If one of them had a problem, they all showed up. At the heart of the family was Dana Rhoden. She was 37 years old, a nurse's aide, and a single mother who worked long hours but made time for every one of her children. People described her as kind, dependable, and fiercely devoted to her family. She lived for her kids. Her son, Frankie Rhoden, was 20. He worked with his father in a local construction business and had 2 young sons of his own. Frankie was known to be friendly and protective, a good dad trying to provide for his family. He lived with his fiancée, Hannah Gilley, who was just 20 years old. She was described as sweet, quiet, and hands-on with her toddler. The two had just welcomed a new baby. Chris Rhoden Sr., Dana's ex-husband and the father of several of her children, lived nearby. He was 40, a strong presence in the family and known to be a solid worker, quiet but respected. He ran a small business and sometimes bred fighting roosters. His home was often a hub of activity for the extended family. Their son, Chris Jr., only 16 years old, was still in high school. He loved sports and video games and was often helping his dad on projects. He had a girlfriend. He had plans. Like any teen, he was caught between youth and adulthood, and his life was just beginning. Then there was Hannah Mae Rhoden, just 19 years old. She lived with her mother, Dana, and had 2 children, one just a few days old, barely bigger than a loaf of bread. Hannah had become a mother young, but she embraced it. Those close to her said she glowed when she was with her baby. She was still figuring out life, but she was trying, and she had her whole family behind her. In total, 8 people from the Rhoden family and their extended circle were killed. Along with Chris Sr., Dana, Frankie, Hannah, and Chris Jr., the other victims included Hannah Gilley, Frankie's fiancé, Kenneth Rhoden, Chris Sr.'s older brother, and Gary Rhoden, a cousin. These weren't strangers to one another. They lived a few minutes apart, visited each other often, and helped raise one another's kids. They shared meals, birthdays, holidays, and responsibilities. They were part of each other's daily lives, and most people who knew them, neighbors, classmates, co-workers, would say the same thing. They were just a regular, hard-working family. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And in Pike County, that counted for everything. But on the night of April 21st, 2016, someone planned to tear that bond apart. And by the time the sun came up, the Rhoden family would never be the same again. It was just past midnight on April 21st, 2016. Pike County was sleeping. It was a Thursday night, unremarkable, like most others. The hills were quiet. The gravel road sat undisturbed. Nothing on the surface seemed out of place, but in the darkness, someone, or more than one person, moved through the night with purpose. They weren't breaking in. They weren't robbing. They came for one thing: to kill. At 7:49 a.m., the first 911 call came in. Bobby Jo Manley had gone to check on her brother-in-law, Chris Rhoden Sr., at his trailer on Union Hill Road. What she found was worse than anything she could have imagined. Chris Sr. was lying in his bed. He had been shot multiple times, some of those wounds to the head at close range. The home was quiet, too quiet. Another body was found inside. Gary Rhoden, Chris's cousin. He had been shot as well, killed with the same cold precision. Within minutes, Bobby Jo ran to the next trailer down the road, the home of Dana Rhoden, Chris's ex-wife. She opened the door and stepped into something that didn't feel real. Dana was dead, shot multiple times, including a fatal wound to the head. Her teenage daughter, Hannah Mae Rhoden, was also found. She had been killed in her bed. Her 5-day-old baby girl, Kylie, was beside her, alive, untouched, wrapped in a blanket. Bobby Jo could barely breathe. She called her brother, James Manley. "They're all dead," she said. Law enforcement rushed to the scene, and as they arrived, they realized this wasn't an isolated shooting. This was something far more coordinated. A third trailer sat just up the hill. That's where Frankie Rhoden, Donna and Chris Sr.'s son, lived with his fiancée, Hannah Gilley, and their children. When officers entered, they found Frankie and Hannah both shot to death in their bedroom. Their 6-month-old baby boy was nestled between their bodies, blood on his blanket, but somehow, miraculously, unharmed. There was no forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors. Whoever came into these homes had been let in, or knew how to get in without a sound. By that point, the sheriff's office knew this was more than a tragedy. It was a massacre. Word began to spread. Local news outlets scrambled to make sense of it. Phones rang across town. Families panicked. Some locked their doors for the first time in years. As law enforcement expanded the search, a fourth crime scene was discovered. This one several miles away on Left Fork Road. There, Kenneth Rhoden, Chris Sr.'s older brother, was found in his camper. Shot once. Execution style, just like the others. The final body, Gary Rhoden, Chris Sr.'s cousin, had been found back at the first crime scene. That brought the total to 8 victims across 4 locations. Investigators were stunned by what they saw. Each victim had been killed quickly and with ruthless efficiency. Some were shot multiple times. Some had been shot only once, in vital areas, suggesting the killers knew exactly where to aim. There were no signs of a struggle, no screams heard, no weapons left behind, no shell casings. The homes had been cleared of evidence, down to the smallest detail. Even security systems were tampered with or disabled. The level of planning was unlike anything Pike County law enforcement had ever seen. This wasn't chaotic. This was strategic, calculated, personal. Inside the homes, what haunted the investigators the most wasn't just the blood or the silence. It was the children. 3 of them, all under the age of 3, left alive among the bodies of their parents. One found on the floor, another cradled in a dead mother's arms, a third curled between 2 blood-soaked adults. It was a scene too horrific to process. Seasoned officers were shaken. Some broke down. One would later say, "I've never seen anything like it, and I hope I never will again." As the morning wore on, neighbors gathered behind yellow tape. Some wept. Some stared, hollow-eyed. Word spread through schools, churches, grocery stores. 8 members of the Rhoden family had been slaughtered in a single night, one after the other, in their sleep, in their homes. No one had seen anything. No one had heard gunfire. No one had a clue who could do something like this, or why. Theories began to fly. Some blamed a drug cartel. Others whispered about family feuds. Some said it was revenge, but no one had answers. Sheriff Charles Reeder stepped in front of cameras and told the community what they feared most. There is a killer, possibly more than one, loose in our county. He urged families to arm themselves. He warned that these murders were targeted, but offered no explanation for who the targets were or why. Panic swept through Pike County. People who had once left doors unlocked began sleeping with loaded guns. Children were pulled from school. Women kept their lights on at night. Some moved away entirely. In one night, everything had changed. Behind the scenes, law enforcement agencies from across Ohio and the FBI joined the investigation. Dozens of officers combed through the crime scenes. They searched for tire tracks, surveillance footage, phone records, anything. But what they found again and again was that whoever did this had come prepared. There were no obvious mistakes, no clear leads. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment attack. It was a coordinated multi-location murder involving several individuals who knew their victims, knew their routines, and left almost no trace. For the next few days, all Pike County could do was bury their dead, pray for answers, and wait in fear. And while the Rhoden family's blood had soaked the ground that morning, their secrets were just beginning to rise to the surface. The town of Piketon had never known such darkness. 8 lives lost in one night, a family almost wiped out, and no arrests, no suspects, just grief, just fear. Local news stations scrambled to keep up, but by the second day, it wasn't just Ohio watching. CNN, NBC, the New York Times. They all descended on Pike County. Boom mics and satellite trucks rolled into the sleepy town. Journalists swarmed courthouse steps and roped off gravel roads, all searching for a single answer. Why? In the homes just beyond the yellow tape, neighbors sat stunned. "I've known Dana since she was a teenager," one woman said, her voice cracking on live TV. "She was a good mother. They didn't deserve this. None of them did." Another man stood outside his porch, looking at the news vans just down the road. "I've lived here my whole life. I've never locked my doors. I do now." The fear was real. Parents kept their children indoors. Local businesses closed early. For many, daily life came to a stop. At the local school where Chris Jr. had once attended, students sat in stunned silence. Teachers cried at their desks. Posters and handwritten notes covered the school walls. Messages of love and loss. Grief counselors were brought in. No one knew how to explain it to the children. Law enforcement responded quickly. Over 100 officers were brought into the investigation. Sheriff's deputies, Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, State Highway Patrol, and even the FBI. Helicopters searched from the sky. Drones flew over fields. K-9 units canvassed the woods. Every inch of land between the 4 crime scenes was searched for clues. Sheriff Charles Reeder gave daily press briefings, each tenser than the last. "We believe this family was targeted. We believe the perpetrators are known to them, and we are doing everything in our power to bring them to justice." But still, no motive, no suspects, just rumors and fear. Some speculated about drugs. Chris Sr. had grown marijuana on his property, a fact later confirmed by investigators. Was it a cartel hit? A local rivalry? Others whispered about custody battles and bad blood. But no one had answers, and every theory brought new tension. In the midst of it all, the Rhoden family had to bury their dead. Over the following week, funerals were held, one after the other. 8 caskets, a procession of grief stretching through the streets of Piketon. Entire schools closed for the day. Businesses shut their doors. Friends, teachers, neighbors, and family gathered to say goodbye. At each service, photos lined the walls, smiling faces of the dead, children holding trophies, parents posing with babies, teenagers in football jerseys. It was almost too much to take in. At the funeral for Dana Rhoden, mourners filled the church and spilled into the parking lot. The pastor's voice cracked as he read Psalm 23. Friends clutched each other. Some wailed openly. Many sat in stunned silence. Frankie and Hannah Gilly were buried side by side. Their surviving toddler, just 2 years old, was there, too young to understand what he'd lost. Vigils followed in the days after. Hundreds gathered with candles and prayers. They tied balloons to trees and hung banners on fences. The words read, "Justice for the Rhodens, justice for 8." One of the surviving family members stood in front of a crowd at the courthouse steps, his voice shaking. "We won't stop until we find out who did this, and we won't let fear win." But fear had already crept in, deep. Gun sales spiked across Pike County. Homes installed security cameras for the first time. Churches prayed for protection. Some families left town altogether, packed up what they had and never looked back. Behind the scenes, the investigation ground forward. Thousands of tips poured in. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Every digital footprint was examined. Phones, computers, social media. But weeks turned into months. And still, nothing. The crime had been too well planned, too methodical. Whoever did this knew how to leave no trace. And yet the Rhoden family knew, deep down, that this wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger passing through. This was close. Someone who knew their routine. Someone they'd trusted. And until that person or people were brought into the light, there would be no peace. Pike County waited. The nation watched. And in the shadows, the truth waited to be uncovered. The slaughter of 8 people in one family wasn't just unprecedented, it was terrifying. And the manhunt that followed would become one of the largest and most expensive criminal investigations in Ohio's history. Within days, the Pike County Sheriff's Office and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation had secured the 4 crime scenes. But those scenes, spread across nearly 30 miles, told investigators something chilling. This wasn't random. This was coordinated, military precise. Whoever did this had a plan, and they had executed it with terrifying efficiency. More than 200 officers joined the case in its first week. Crime scene technicians collected thousands of pieces of evidence: shell casing, surveillance footage, tire tracks, fingerprints, DNA. But despite the sheer volume of material, nothing immediately pointed to a suspect. Rumors spread fast. One of the first? A drug cartel hit. Investigators had found evidence of marijuana grows on some of the Rhoden properties. Some even suggested that Chris Sr. was connected to a larger operation. Sheriff Charles Reeder addressed the theory publicly. Yes, there were marijuana operations on the property, but we are not convinced this was drug-related violence. The DEA reviewed the case. Still, no cartel links could be confirmed. That theory began to fade. Others believed it was revenge, maybe over a custody dispute or an old grudge. Some even floated the idea that the family was killed by mistake. Wrong people, wrong place. But as investigators dug deeper into the Rhodens' relationships, a pattern started to form. This wasn't mistaken identity. This was intentional, calculated. The FBI was called in. The Bureau brought high-tech resources: forensic analysts, behavioral profilers, surveillance specialists. But Pike County was rural, isolated, and low-tech. Few surveillance cameras, patchy cell service, spotty internet. For every lead, there were 2 dead ends. The killers had known this. They hadn't just planned the murders, they'd planned how to disappear. Warrants were issued. Dozens of search operations launched. Investigators scoured nearby properties, computers, phones, vehicles. They even combed through trash, hunting for receipts, packaging, anything that didn't belong. But still, no smoking gun. Meanwhile, a series of unrelated arrests muddied the waters. People who had prior beef with the Rhodens. Locals with drug charges. One man was picked up for making threats online. Another was caught with weapons charges nearby. But none of them were tied to the murders. And the Rhoden family? Still no justice. Frustration mounted. Weeks turned into months. Each press conference was more strained than the last. Reporters asked the same question over and over. Do you have suspects? The answer was always the same. We are pursuing every lead. Behind the scenes, experts from across the country were called in to help. Behavioral analysts, criminal profilers, forensic psychologists. What kind of person or people could pull off 8 coordinated executions in one night and leave behind living infants? One profiler called it the work of someone with control issues and a strong personal motive. Another pointed out the precision. No signs of forced entry, no ransacking, nothing stolen. This was about eliminating people, not about gain. But without confessions or eyewitnesses, the pieces didn't fit. Not yet. Investigators were certain about one thing. Whoever committed this crime had help. No single person could pull off 4 separate killings in 3 separate locations, nearly simultaneously, without leaving chaos behind. They believed it was a group, a family even, people with a reason to kill and a bond strong enough to keep silent. That theory led them to examine those closest to the Rhodens: exes, former in-laws, strange friends. They looked at custody arrangements, financial disputes, fights that had simmered quietly over the years. Nothing stood out at first, but in time, a name would keep surfacing. One family, one connection. And when it finally clicked, the investigation would explode in a direction no one could have predicted. But for now, Pike County held its breath, and investigators kept digging, because somewhere in those quiet hills, the killers were watching. For over a year, the investigation into the Rhoden family murders moved slowly, deliberately, every theory exhausted, every relationship scrutinized. But one family name began surfacing again and again, a name investigators couldn't ignore: the Wagners. At the center was George Billy Wagner III and his wife Angela Wagner, longtime residents of southern Ohio, farmers, business owners, churchgoers. They appeared to most like any other small-town family, but behind the curtains there was friction, control, and obsession. Their sons, George Wagner IV and Edward Jake Wagner, were raised in that tight grip, hardworking, quiet, and loyal to their parents above all else. What connected them to the Rhodens was Jake. Jake Wagner had once been in a relationship with Hannah Mae Rhoden, Dana's daughter. The two had a daughter together, Sophia. At first, the relationship was typical teenage love, but it soured fast. Friends of Hannah described Jake as possessive, controlling, always checking her phone, demanding to know where she was and with whom. And when Hannah finally left the relationship, Jake didn't let go. She wanted to co-parent peacefully, but Jake, and more importantly, the Wagner family, had other plans. The Wagners believed Sophia belonged with them. Entirely, they pushed for full custody. Hannah refused. Investigators would later uncover text messages from Jake, repeatedly pressuring Hannah to sign documents, granting him full custody. She wouldn't. In one text just months before her death, Hannah confided in a friend, "If anything happens to me, Jake and them did it." She had grown increasingly fearful. She told family members that the Wagners were trying to take her baby away. She wouldn't give in. And that decision may have sealed her fate. The Wagners were obsessed with control, not just of Sophia, but of everything around her. Investigators learned that Angela Wagner even kept spreadsheets detailing Hannah's parenting decisions. How often she breastfed, who watched the baby, what Hannah posted online. This wasn't co-parenting, it was surveillance, control, at all costs. In 2017, a year after the murders, the Wagner family did something strange. Without warning, they packed up everything: children, animals, guns, and moved to Alaska. They told neighbors they needed a fresh start, but to investigators it looked like something else: an escape. The Wagners settled in a remote part of Kenai, Alaska. But by then, investigators had already been watching, quietly, carefully, for months. They built a profile. They examined the family's financial records, communication patterns, purchases, gun sales, vehicle logs, and what they found was chilling. The Wagners had bought custom parts used to build homemade silencers, parts that matched bullet markings found at the Rhoden crime scenes. They had switched out vehicles after the murders, some reportedly modified to hide compartments. Cell phone data showed suspicious gaps on the night of the killings. Devices turned off, rerouted, moved in tandem across Pike County and back. One by one, the dots connected. But it wasn't just evidence, it was behavior. Neighbors in Ohio had long described the Wagners as private, unusually close. The boys rarely dated, never socialized. Angela was always in control. Jake obeyed his mother. George IV followed orders. And after the murders, those same neighbors noticed something off. They didn't talk about it, didn't show emotion. It was like it never happened, one said. Another recalled a chilling moment at the funeral for one of the Rhodens. They showed up, sat in the back, and just watched. In Alaska, the pattern continued. Locals said the family kept to themselves. Angela homeschooled the kids. Billy stayed on the property. Jake worked quietly. No friends, no visitors, no trust. But back in Ohio, the pressure was building. Surveillance intensified. The Wagners were being followed, phones tapped, intercepted conversations analyzed. Slowly, the case was coming together. Then came the turning point, when investigators obtained the Wagners' electronic devices and began recovering deleted messages, photos, and files. And what they found was damning. Conversations between family members about the night of the murders, shared knowledge, references to the Rhodens, mentions of firearms and silencers, all behind encrypted apps and layers of secrecy. It was enough. On November 13, 2018, 2 years after the massacre, law enforcement executed a sweeping raid across multiple states. George Billy Wagner III, Angela Wagner, George Wagner IV, and Jake Wagner were all arrested and charged with the murders of 8 members of the Rhoden family. The charges included aggravated murder, conspiracy, burglary, tampering with evidence, unlawful possession of dangerous ordnance, and more. For the first time since April 2016, Pike County could breathe. The killers had faces, and they weren't strangers. They were family, a family so obsessed with control, they murdered another family, execution style, in the dead of night. 8 lives gone, over custody, and the rest of the story would come out in court, one testimony at a time. It was just before Thanksgiving 2018 when the news broke. Authorities announced the unthinkable. 4 members of the Wagner family had been arrested and charged with the murders of 8 members of the Rhoden family. George Billy Wagner III, Angela Wagner, George Wagner IV, Edward Jake Wagner. The same family that once sat quietly at the Rhodens' funerals. The same people who had publicly grieved, who had attended vigils, who had comforted others while allegedly hiding the truth. The arrests were coordinated across multiple states. In Lexington, Kentucky, George Wagner III was taken into custody during a traffic stop. Angela was arrested in Scioto County, Ohio. George IV and Jake were both apprehended without incident. For 2.5 years, the investigation had worked in silence, meticulously, relentlessly, layer by layer. Now the mask was off. What emerged was a level of planning and calculation almost unheard of in rural crime. The Wagners had spent months preparing for the murders. According to the indictments, they mapped out every detail. Who would be home, when to strike, how to silence the shots. They studied the Rhodens' routines. They hacked into surveillance systems. They deleted texts and encrypted their phones. They purchased and built homemade silencers to avoid waking neighbors. Authorities found custom shoes designed to leave behind indistinct prints. But they missed one. A partial shoe print at one of the murder scenes was matched to a pair purchased by a Wagner family member, providing one of the first physical links to the killings. Investigators also uncovered evidence of deleted text messages sent by Jake and George IV around the time of the murders. On recovered hard drives, they found the deleted backups of phones and surveillance recordings, painstakingly scrubbed, but not quite enough to hide forever. One conversation hinted at motive. She wasn't going to let us have her. That baby was ours. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about money. It was about control, about bloodlines, about one family believing they had the right to decide the fate of another. The reaction across Pike County was swift and emotional. People were stunned, horrified, betrayed. Some had known the Wagners for years. Others had gone to school with them, worked alongside them, even broken bread with them. A local shop owner summed it up best. They lived right here all this time, and they were the ones. I can't wrap my head around it. There was grief again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Relief. The Rhoden family finally had a name for their pain, a reason, however dark, and a promise that justice was finally in motion. In the small courthouse of Pike County, the legal process began. The Wagners, now facing 8 counts of aggravated murder each, entered not guilty pleas. Prosecutors announced they would pursue the death penalty. But this case was far from over. Behind every charge was a story. Behind every story, a clue. And the next chapter would unfold in the courtroom. After the whirlwind of arrests and months of pretrial motions, the courtroom drama finally began to unravel the darkest parts of the Rhoden family massacre. What followed was a series of confessions and trials that laid bare the full horror of what had happened and who was truly responsible. In April 2021, the quietest piece of the puzzle suddenly spoke up. Edward Jake Wagner entered a guilty plea for 5 of the murders. In a confession that shocked the nation, Jake admitted to playing a central role in the massacre, the shootings, the cover-up, and the destruction of evidence. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Jake agreed to testify against his family members, shedding light on the cold and calculated planning that preceded the murders. In his own words, Jake described the months of preparation, the silencer parts they bought, the hours spent stalking the Rhoden's daily routines, the careful efforts to avoid leaving fingerprints or witnesses. He detailed the chilling night of April 21st, 2016, the precision with which shots were fired, the methodical nature of the executions, and the coldness required to leave 2 infants alive, yet surrounded by death. Jake's testimony wasn't just factual. It was chillingly emotional, stripped of remorse. "I did what had to be done," he said. For the first time, the family's obsession with control became fully clear. Shortly after Jake's plea, Angela Wagner shocked the courtroom by entering her own guilty plea. She apologized, not just to the Rhoden family, but to the entire community, expressing deep regret for the pain caused. Her confession detailed her central role in orchestrating the killings. She admitted to encouraging and directing the planning, ordering purchases of weapons, and coordinating the cleanup efforts afterward. Angela described how she kept the family united in their secret, pressuring her sons to stay loyal and silent. Her courtroom apology was a rare glimpse into the mind of someone who had driven such violence. "I was wrong," she said simply, "but I was afraid of losing control." Her plea spared her a trial and secured a lengthy prison sentence. But the full weight of her actions echoed through every word. The final Wagner son to face trial was George Wagner IV, the quiet middle brother. His 2022 trial gripped Pike County and true crime fans nationwide. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man deeply involved in the conspiracy, the one who helped build silencers, erase evidence, and cover the family's tracks after the killings. Witness after witness testified. Neighbors recounted strange behavior. Friends spoke of George's silence on the subject. Experts explained forensic evidence linking him to the crime scenes. The courtroom was tense, heavy with emotion. One survivor's family member spoke directly to George in their victim impact statement, their voice trembling with grief. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict, guilty on all counts. George Wagner IV was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Outside the courthouse, family members wept, some hugging in relief. The community, long haunted by the tragedy, finally saw a measure of justice. But even with the verdicts and confessions, the shadow of the massacre would linger, a brutal reminder of how far obsession, control, and betrayal could go. And while 4 of the Wagners had pleaded guilty or been convicted, George Billy Wagner III, the family patriarch, awaited trial, his story still unfolding behind closed doors. The massacre left more than just empty homes and shattered families. It left behind survivors, fragile, confused children, some barely old enough to understand the horror that had unfolded around them. Babies who had witnessed unspeakable violence and were suddenly orphaned in the blink of an eye. The Rhoden children who survived were placed into the care of relatives and foster families, their lives forever altered by the brutal loss of parents, siblings, and cousins. Guardians spoke quietly of the challenges, sleepless nights, nightmares, and the slow, painful process of piecing together trust and safety from the rubble. Pike County itself struggled to heal. A once close-knit community was shaken to its core. Neighbors who had shared quiet smiles on the street now exchanged uneasy glances. Local schools provided counseling services, but the emotional scars ran deep and wide. Investigators who had worked the case for years reflected on the unique brutality and complexity. Many said it was unlike anything they had seen before. The cold calculation of a family killing their own, driven by obsession and control over a child custody dispute. The emotional toll on law enforcement was profound too. Long nights piecing together evidence from burned-out trailers, the weight of 8 lives lost forever. Journalists covering the case spoke of the ripple effects. The story struck a chord nationwide, not just for its horrific details, but for the warning it held about domestic violence and custody battles spiraling into deadly violence. In the aftermath, Ohio law enforcement agencies began updating their training and protocols. The Rhoden massacre became a case study on the dangers lurking beneath the surface in family disputes, especially those involving custody and control. Child welfare advocates cited the tragedy as a call to action, pushing for better protections and earlier intervention in high-risk domestic situations. The wounds remain, but the hope is that this horror will not be forgotten, that the lives lost and the children left behind will drive change, ensuring no family suffers a nightmare like the Rhodens again. As Pike County slowly moves forward, the legacy of the massacre lingers, a solemn reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are those closest to home. Could this massacre have been prevented? It's a question that haunts everyone touched by the tragedy. The investigators who pieced together the evidence, the family members left behind, and the community still searching for answers. Signs of escalating tension and threats had surfaced long before that night in April 2016. Yet how does a family so tightly bound by blood and history unravel into such devastating violence without anyone stepping in sooner? This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about control, how obsession can twist love into possession, how family loyalty can become a weapon. In rural communities where privacy is prized and help often feels distant, the warning signs of danger can go unnoticed or unreported. The Rhoden massacre lays bare the silent struggles hidden behind closed doors, battles over custody, power, and identity that can spiral beyond control. And it challenges us to ask, how do we better protect the vulnerable? How do we balance respect for family privacy with the urgent need to intervene? Each victim here was a life with hopes, dreams, and stories cut painfully short. Their faces remind us of the cost of silence and the importance of listening when someone reaches out. As the music fades, their memories linger, a solemn call to awareness, compassion, and vigilance. Because sometimes the darkest stories teach the most crucial lessons. Do you think the entire truth has been revealed in the Rhoden family massacre? There are still unanswered questions, layers of pain and complexity that may never fully come to light. We invite you to share your thoughts, respectfully, down in the comments. Let's discuss what this case tells us about family, control, and justice. If you want to explore more stories like this, check out our playlist on family-related mass murders, cases that reveal the dark side of the ties that bind. For more true stories that must be told, subscribe to Crime Scene. Stay safe.